In the bitter winter of 1348, when frost painted the windows of parish schools in crystalline patterns and children's breath rose like prayers in the frigid air, young scholars learned their letters with fingers so cold they could barely grip their styluses. Yet still they came, day after frozen day, because knowledge was the only inheritance many of them would ever receive. Good evening, dear friend. As you settle into the warmth of your bed tonight, let me carry you back across the centuries to a time when winter was not merely cold, but a test of endurance that shaped the very souls of those who lived through it. Come with me now to the year 1348, to the county of Lincolnshire in England, where our story begins. Thomas of Barton was 11 years old the winter he learned that suffering and learning were inseparable companions. He was a slight boy, smaller than most his age, with dark hair that his mother cut in a bowl shape around his head every few months, and eyes the color of the muddy river Witham that flowed a mile from his village. His father, William, was a freeman farmer who held 20 acres from the lord of the manor, enough land to keep the family from starvation in good years, though never enough to make them comfortable. Thomas had 2 younger sisters, Agnes, who was 9, and little Margaret, only 5, with a gap-toothed smile that made even the stern village priest soften when he saw her. The family lived in a timber-framed house with wattle and daub walls that his grandfather had built. It had 2 rooms, one for living and one for sleeping, and a thatched roof that his father repaired each autumn. Smoke from their central hearth escaped through a hole in the roof, though much of it seemed to linger inside, stinging their eyes and coating everything with a thin layer of soot. In winter, they brought their 3 sheep inside at night to help warm the house, and the smell of damp wool and animal bodies mingled with the smoke and the scent of whatever pottage his mother had cooked over the fire. Thomas had been attending the parish school in the nearby village of Barton upon Humber since he was 7 years old. His father had made this decision after much deliberation with Thomas's mother, Eleanor. It cost them 3 pence a quarter, a sum that represented a significant portion of their modest income, plus the loss of Thomas's labor in the fields and around the house. But William had dreams for his son that extended beyond the boundaries of their 20 acres. "The boy is quick," he would say to Eleanor in the evenings, watching Thomas practice writing his letters on a wax tablet by the firelight. "Quicker than I ever was. Father Edmund says he has a mind for learning. Perhaps he could become a clerk or even enter the church. Think of it, Eleanor, our son, able to read Latin, to write contracts, to rise above the mud and the plow." Eleanor was less certain. She loved her son fiercely and worried about the 2-mile walk he had to make each day to reach the school, worried about the cold, worried about the dangers that might befall a small boy on the winter roads. But she also understood her husband's aspirations, and she shared them in her own quieter way. So she mended Thomas's clothes with special care, saved the best portions of their meals for him, and each morning before dawn, she wrapped him in every piece of warm clothing they could spare. The school was held in a room attached to St. Peter's Church, a stone building that had stood in Barton for nearly 200 years. It was a single chamber, perhaps 20 feet by 15, with a packed earth floor and two narrow windows covered with oiled cloth that let in a murky light even on the brightest days. In winter, those windows were shuttered against the cold, and the room existed in a perpetual gloom broken only by tallow candles that the students' families were expected to provide. The air inside was thick with the breath of 20 boys aged 7 to 14, the smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and the acrid smoke from candles that sputtered and dripped. Father Edmund was the schoolmaster, a man of perhaps 40 years who had studied at Cambridge in his youth before an illness. Some said it was falling sickness. Others whispered it was something darker, had ended his prospects for advancement in the church. He was tall and gaunt, with a scholar's stoop and fingers perpetually stained with ink. He was not a cruel man by the standards of the time, but neither was he particularly gentle. He believed firmly that learning required discipline, and that discipline often required the rod. A bundle of birch switches stood in the corner of the schoolroom, and rarely did a day pass without some boy feeling their sting across his palms or the backs of his legs. The curriculum was straightforward: Latin grammar, reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and the recitation of prayers and psalms. The boys began each day by chanting their Pater Noster and Ave Maria, their voices rising in uneven unison in the cold air. Then they would practice their letters, copying passages from the Psalter or Donatus's Latin grammar onto wax tablets with iron styluses, the scratching sound filling the room like mice in the walls. The older boys, those who had mastered basic literacy, would advance to copying on parchment, precious stuff that cost dearly and had to be prepared from sheepskin by skilled craftsmen. When a boy made an error on parchment, Father Edmund's displeasure was swift and memorable. But it was the cold that Thomas remembered most vividly from that winter. The cold was a presence, almost a living thing, that inhabited the schoolroom from November through March. There was a small brazier in the center of the room, fed with charcoal that the boys' families contributed, but its warmth barely reached beyond a radius of a few feet. The boys closest to it sweated while those at the edges of the room shivered violently. Father Edmund rotated their positions each week, which was meant to be fair, but only ensured that every boy spent equal time in misery. Thomas's position that first week of December was near the back wall, as far from the brazier as it was possible to be. He sat on a rough wooden bench. There were no desks, and the boys rested their wax tablets on their laps or held them in their hands, and tried to focus on copying out the declension of the Latin word dominus, while his body trembled with cold. He wore everything he owned: a rough woolen tunic that reached his knees, wool leggings that his mother had knitted, and that were now more darned patched than original material, a second tunic over the first, and a cloak of undyed wool that was thin and provided little protection. On his feet, he wore leather shoes that his father had made, stuffed with straw for insulation, but the straw was old and compressed, and his toes had lost feeling within an hour of entering the schoolroom. His fingers were the worst. They were red and swollen, the joints stiff and aching. When he tried to grip the stylus to form the letters, His hand shook so badly that the marks came out as jagged scratches. He breathed on his fingers, tucked them under his arms, rubbed them together, but nothing seemed to help. The iron stylus was so cold it felt like it was burning his skin where he touched it. "Thomas of Barton," Father Edmund's voice cracked across the room like a whip. "Let me see your work." Thomas's heart sank. He stood on numb feet and made his way carefully across the room, trying not to stumble, trying not to draw attention to his shaking. He held out his wax tablet for Father Edmund's inspection. The priest looked at it for a long moment, his face unreadable in the dim light. Then he looked at Thomas, and something, perhaps pity, perhaps merely irritation, flickered across his features. "This is illegible," he said, his voice cold but not angry. "You will copy it again. And this time, try to form letters rather than the scratchings of a hen." "Yes, Father," Thomas whispered. "But first," Father Edmund continued, "come sit here by the brazier for a time. Your hands are no use to anyone in that state." A murmur went through the room. This was an unusual mercy, but Father Edmund silenced it with a glance. Thomas moved to the bench nearest the brazier, displacing a larger boy named Robert who shot him a look of pure hatred but said nothing. Thomas held his hands toward the warmth, and as the blood began to return to his fingers, the pain that came with it was extraordinary. It felt as if his hands were being stabbed with 1,000 needles, and he had to bite his lip to keep from crying out. Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes, which he tried to hide by bowing his head over his tablet. After perhaps a quarter of an hour, when Thomas's hands had regained some feeling and flexibility, Father Edmund directed him back to his original seat. The brief warmth made the return to the cold even more brutal, but Thomas said nothing. He bent over his tablet and carefully, painstakingly, began to copy the declension again. This time, his letters were shaky but legible. The school day ran from dawn until mid-afternoon, with a brief break at midday when the boys ate whatever food they had brought from home. Thomas's meal that day consisted of a small loaf of rye bread, dark and dense and a day old, and a piece of hard cheese the size of his thumb. He ate slowly, trying to make it last, trying to fill the hollow feeling in his stomach. Some of the wealthier boys had meat pies or apples or even small ale to drink, and the smell of their food made Thomas's mouth water, but he tried not to look at them. Envy was a sin, Father Edmund reminded them often, and besides, there was nothing to be gained by wanting what he could not have. Next to Thomas sat his friend John, the son of a carpenter, who was 10 years old and shared Thomas's slight build. John had brought only a crust of bread for his meal, even less than Thomas had, and his thin face was pinched with cold and hunger. They didn't speak much. It was too cold for unnecessary words, but their friendship was a quiet comfort in the harsh schoolroom. John's father had died the previous summer of a fever, and his mother was struggling to keep the family fed. There were whispers in the village that she might have to apprentice John out soon, which would mean the end of his schooling. After the meal, Father Edmund led them in recitation of Latin verb conjugations. Amo, amas, amat, the boys chanted, their voices rough and uncertain. Amemis, Amadis, Amit. The rhythm of it was almost soothing, and Thomas found himself swaying slightly as he recited, his mind drifting as his body tried to conserve warmth. When the school day finally ended and the boys were dismissed, Thomas wrapped his thin cloak tightly around himself and stepped out into the December afternoon. The sun was already low on the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the frozen ground. His breath clouded before his face, and the inside of his nose hurt with each inhalation of the frigid air. The 2-mile walk home felt endless. The road was rutted and frozen hard as stone, and Thomas's feet ached with each step. His toes had begun to hurt during the last hour of school, a burning, tingling pain that he recognized from previous winters. He had seen what frostbite could do to a person's extremities. Old Martin the shepherd had lost 3 toes to the cold 5 winters ago, and he walked with a pronounced limp now. Thomas tried to wiggle his toes inside his shoes as he walked, trying to keep the blood flowing, but he wasn't sure if he could feel them anymore. The landscape around him was bleak and beautiful in the fading light. The fields lay bare and frozen, the furrows visible as parallel ridges of frost. Bare trees stood like skeletons against the sky, their branches coated with ice that sparkled when the weak sunlight caught it. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from the houses of his village, and the sight gave him strength to keep walking. He was perhaps halfway home when he saw the figure ahead on the road. As he drew closer, he recognized Agnes, his 9-year-old sister, wrapped in a shawl and jumping up and down to keep warm. When she saw him, she ran forward, her face bright with cold and excitement. Thomas, Mother sent me to meet you," she said. Agnes paused, out of breath from running. "She said to tell you to hurry. Father has news." Thomas felt a spike of worry. "What news? Is everything all right?" "I don't know. Father wouldn't say in front of me and Margaret. But he looks worried, Thomas. Truly worried." They walked together, quickly now, Agnes chattering about her day while Thomas's mind raced with possibilities. Had something happened to the Lord's tax collector come early? Had one of their animals died? In the harsh economy of their lives, any unexpected change was likely to be a disaster. When they reached the house, Thomas pushed open the door and stepped into the relative warmth of the interior. His mother was at the hearth, stirring a pot of pottage, and the smell of it, onions, turnips, barley, and a bone for flavor, made Thomas's stomach clench with hunger. Little Margaret was playing with a corn-husk doll near the fire. His father sat on their one stool, his hands clasped between his knees, his face gravely. "Thomas," his father said. "Come here, son." Thomas approached, Agnes close behind him. His father looked at her, and then at Elena. "You too, Elena. You should hear this." Elena wiped her hands on her apron and came to stand beside her husband. Margaret, sensing the serious atmosphere, abandoned her doll and came to lean against her mother's leg. "I was at the manor court today," William began. The manor court was held once a month, where the Lord's steward heard disputes, collected fines, and announced the Lord's edicts. There was news from London, from the king's court. And it's grave news, I'm afraid. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. There's a sickness, he continued. A terrible sickness that has come from the east, from foreign lands. It started in the ports, Bristol, Southampton, London. They say it kills quickly within days, sometimes within hours. They say it's spreading inland, moving along the roads and rivers. Eleanor's hand went to her mouth. How terrible, she breathed. But surely it won't reach us here. We're far from the ports, far from the great roads. I don't know, William said. The steward said the king has ordered prayers in all the churches, that we must trust in God's mercy. But he also said that villages are being emptied. That whole family is dying. Thomas felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the winter air. He had heard of such things, plagues and pestilences mentioned in sermons, but they had always seemed distant, biblical things that happened to other people in other times. What should we do? Eleanor asked, and Thomas heard the fear in her voice that she was trying to hide for the sake of her children. We pray, William said. We keep our family close and we pray. And we go on with our lives because what else can we do? The fields will need plowing come spring, sickness or no sickness. Thomas will continue his schooling. We've paid for the quarter and will not waste that money. And we'll trust that God will protect us if we remain faithful. But there was doubt in his father's voice. Thomas heard it clearly. And when he caught his mother's eye, he saw the same fear he felt reflected in her gaze. That night, Thomas lay in the sleeping room with his sisters, all three of them huddled together under their shared blanket for warmth, and tried not to think about the news his father had brought. But sleep was long in coming, and when it finally arrived, his dreams were troubled and dark. The next morning dawned even colder than the day before, and when Thomas looked out the door, he saw that snow had fallen during the night. Not much, just a thin white coating that crunched under his shoes as he began his walk to school. The sky was heavy and gray, promising more snow to come. At school, the boys were subdued, and Thomas realized that the news his father had heard at the manor court had spread throughout the village. Father Edmund led them in extra prayers that morning, asking God to spare them from the pestilence, to have mercy on Christian souls, to protect the innocent. The Latin words washed over Thomas, beautiful and meaningless, and somehow comforting in their familiarity. But then it was back to lessons, back to the cold and the struggle to form letters with numb fingers, back to the endless recitations and copying. Thomas's position that week was slightly closer to the brazier, which was a small mercy, but his feet and hands still ached with cold. By midday, he noticed that the tips of his fingers had turned white, and when he pressed them, they didn't hurt, which he knew was a bad sign. Father Edmund noticed too and sent him to the brazier again, and again came that excruciating pain as the blood returned. During the meal break, Thomas sat with John and another boy named Stephen, who was 12 and the son of a baker. Stephen's family was better off than most, and he usually had good food for his midday meal. But today he had brought extra, and he shared it with Thomas and John without being asked. "My father says we should help one another," Stephen said simply, handing Thomas a small meat pie that was still faintly warm. "He says that in times of trouble, charity is our duty." Thomas accepted it gratefully, his eyes stinging with sudden tears that he told himself were from the cold. The pie was delicious, real meat, not just gristle and fat, mixed with onions and herbs and wrapped in pastry. He made himself eat it slowly, savoring each bite. "Do you think the sickness will come here?" John asked quietly, voicing the question that all of them had been thinking. "I don't know," Stephen said. "My father says God will protect the righteous." But he stopped, looking troubled. "But what?" Thomas prompted. "But if that's true, why do bad things happen to good people? Old Goodwife Alice is the kindest person in the village, and she lost her husband and 2 sons to the fever last spring. Was she not righteous enough?" It was the kind of question that could get you in trouble if Father Edmund overheard, the kind of question that suggested doubt in God's justice. But Father Edmund was outside, speaking with a parent, and the boys were alone. "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that we're not meant to understand everything. That's what Father Edmund says. That God's ways are mysterious." "That's a convenient answer when you can't explain something," Stephen said, but there was no heat in his voice, only weariness. They sat in silence for a moment, 3 boys in a cold room, sharing food and fear, and the unspoken understanding that their world was changing in ways they couldn't control. The afternoon lessons seemed to stretch on forever. Thomas's eyes burned with fatigue, and his body ached from sitting still in the cold for so many hours. His mind kept drifting, imagining the sickness his father had described, imagining it creeping along the roads toward their village like some malevolent living thing. He forced himself to focus on his tablet, on copying out the passage from the Psalter that Father Edmund had assigned. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The familiar words were soothing, and Thomas found comfort in forming each letter carefully, precisely, even though his fingers were clumsy with cold. When he was finally dismissed and began the long walk home, the light was already fading. More snow had fallen during the day, and the world was muffled and strange. Thomas's feet were so cold now that he couldn't feel them at all, which was both a relief. At least they didn't hurt, and terrifying. He knew what it meant when you stopped feeling the cold. He tried walking faster, stamping his feet with each step to force the blood to flow, but he was tired and hungry, and the effort seemed enormous. He was perhaps a mile from home when he slipped on a patch of ice hidden under the snow and fell hard, landing on his hands and knees. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, and for a moment he just knelt there in the snow, gasping. When he tried to stand, he found that his right ankle hurt badly. He must have twisted it in the fall. He limped forward, testing it, and decided that it would bear his weight, but just barely. Each step sent a spike of pain up his leg, but there was nothing to do except keep walking. To stop, to sit down in the snow and rest, would be death. He knew that with the clarity that comes from growing up in a harsh climate. The cold would take him if he let it. So he walked on, limping, stumbling occasionally, his breath coming in gasps that hurt his lungs. The world had narrowed to just this, one foot in front of the other, again and again, while darkness gathered around him and snow began to fall more heavily. He had almost reached the edge of his village when he saw a figure coming toward him through the snow. As it drew closer, he recognized his father, wrapped in his cloak and carrying a lantern. "Thomas," his father's voice was sharp with worry and relief. "Thank God. Your mother was worried when you didn't arrive at the usual time. Are you hurt?" "I fell," Thomas managed through chattering teeth. "My ankle. And father, my feet. I can't feel them." His father's face went grim. He bent and picked Thomas up, hoisting the boy into his arms despite his size and weight, and began carrying him the last few hundred yards to the house. Thomas, beyond pride or embarrassment, let himself be carried and rested his head against his father's shoulder. At home, his mother cried out when she saw them. She had Thomas sit by the fire and carefully removed his shoes and the rags he had wrapped around his feet for extra warmth. His feet were dead white, the toes waxy looking, and when she touched them, Thomas felt nothing. "Get snow," she said to Agnes. "Quickly now." Agnes looked confused but did as she was told, running outside and coming back with a bowl of clean snow. Alina took the snow and began to rub it gently on Thomas's feet, and gradually, agonizingly, sensation began to return. Thomas bit down on a piece of leather his father gave him to keep from crying out. The pain was extraordinary, a burning, stabbing agony that brought tears streaming down his face. "I know, love, I know," his mother murmured, working methodically. "But if we can get the blood flowing again, you'll keep your toes. Stay strong now." It took perhaps half an hour, though it felt like years to Thomas. Gradually, the color returned to his feet, and the pain began to subside to a dull, throbbing ache. His mother wrapped his feet in wool and made him sit close to the fire with them propped up. "You're not going to school tomorrow," she said, and her voice had a note of finality that Thomas knew better than to argue with. "But mother..." "No. You'll stay home until your feet are healed and this cold spell breaks. We're not losing your toes, and we're not losing you. Your father and I will discuss the rest." After Thomas had eaten some pottage and settled in the sleeping room with his sisters, he heard his parents talking in low voices by the fire. He couldn't make out all the words, but he caught enough. "Too dangerous. Waste the money we've paid. Is more important. What if the sickness comes?" He fell asleep before they reached any conclusion, exhausted by pain and fear and cold, and dreamed of white fields and dark skies, and a sense of something terrible approaching from far away. Thomas remained at home for 3 days while his feet healed and a blizzard raged outside, piling snow against the walls of the house, until his father had to dig a path to the animal shed each morning. During those 3 days, confined to the house with his family, Thomas experienced a strange mixture of relief and guilt. Relief because he was warm, or at least warmer than he had been at school, and because his feet were healing, the angry red color fading to pink and then back to something approaching normal. Guilt because he knew each day he missed was a day of education lost, a day his parents' hard-earned coins were being wasted. His mother seemed to sense his troubled thoughts. On the second day, as she sat by the fire mending one of his father's tunics, she looked up at him and said, "Learning isn't just what happens in Father Edmund's schoolroom, Thomas. Your grandfather never attended school a day in his life, yet he was the wisest man I ever knew. He could read the weather, understand animals, and settle disputes between neighbors. He taught your father everything about working the land, about being a good man. That's learning too." Thomas nodded, but he didn't entirely believe her. The learning his grandfather had possessed was valuable, certainly, but it was common learning, the kind that every freeman's son absorbed simply by living. What Father Edmund offered was different. The ability to read and write, to understand Latin, to move in the world of clerks and priests and educated men. That was the kind of learning that could lift a family out of the mud, and Thomas felt the weight of his parents' hopes pressing down on him every time he thought about it. On the third day, his father came in from checking the animals with news. "The snow has stopped," he announced. "The road to Barton should be passable by tomorrow, though it will be hard walking." He looked at Thomas, assessing him. "How do your feet feel, son?" Thomas wiggled his toes experimentally. They ached and they were still tender, but the pain was bearable. "Better, father. Much better." William nodded slowly. "Then you'll return to school the day after tomorrow. But your mother and I have been talking, and we've decided some things. You'll take an extra blanket with you. We'll wrap it around your shoulders under your cloak. And you'll wear 2 pairs of stockings, even if we have to knit new ones tonight." And he paused. "If the cold becomes too severe, if you feel your feet going numb again, you're to come home immediately. Do you understand? Your education is important, but not more important than your life." "Yes, Father," Thomas said, though privately he wondered how he would know when the cold had become too severe. It was always cold. That was simply the nature of winter. That night, his mother and Agnes sat up late by the firelight, knitting furiously to make Thomas an extra pair of stockings from their precious store of wool. Thomas watched them from his pallet, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, their fingers moving with practiced speed, and felt a surge of love so strong it made his chest ache. His family had so little, yet they gave him everything they could. When he returned to school 2 days later, the world had been transformed by the snow. The road was a narrow path cut through drifts that reached Thomas's waist in places, and the walk that usually took him 3/4 of an hour took nearly twice that long. He arrived at the schoolroom sweating under his layers of clothing despite the cold, his face red with exertion. The schoolroom seemed more crowded than usual, and Thomas soon realized why. Several boys were missing. Father Edmund took attendance by calling out names, and the absences were noted in his ledger with a scratch of his quill. Robert Tanner's son was missing. So was young Edward, the Reeves' grandson. So was Peter, whose father was the village blacksmith. "Are they ill, father?" someone asked. Father Edmund's face was carefully neutral. Some are ill, yes. Others have been kept home because of the snow and the cold. Let us pray for their swift recovery and return. But there was something in his voice that made Thomas's stomach clench with worry. The lessons that day were interrupted multiple times by visitors, parents collecting their sons, bringing news, speaking in low, urgent voices with Father Edmund at the door. Each time the priest's face grew more grave, more lined with worry. Finally, shortly after midday, he dismissed the class entirely. "Go home to your families," he told them, his voice heavy. "The school is suspended until after Christmas. God be with you all." The boys looked at each other in confusion and growing fear. Christmas was still 2 weeks away. School was never suspended for so long unless something was terribly wrong. Thomas walked home with John, who lived in the same direction, and Stephen, whose route took him past Thomas's village. They walked in near silence, each lost in their own thoughts, until Stephen finally spoke. "My father heard at the market yesterday that the sickness has reached Lincoln," he said quietly. Lincoln was the cathedral city, perhaps 20 miles to the south. He said people are dying by the dozens. They can't dig graves fast enough in the frozen ground, so they're just stacking the bodies in a warehouse near the river. Thomas felt bile rise in his throat. "That can't be true," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I hope it's not," Stephen said. "But my father doesn't lie to me. He says we need to be prepared, that we should stay close to home and avoid travelers." They parted ways at the crossroads, and Thomas continued alone. The landscape around him, so beautiful with its coating of fresh snow just days before, now seemed ominous and hostile. Every shadow could hide some invisible threat. Every person he passed on the road, and there were few, as most people were staying close to home, might be carrying the pestilence. When he reached his house and told his parents that school had been suspended, they exchanged a long look. "It's here then," his mother said softly. "Or close enough that Father Edmund is worried." "We don't know that," William said, but without much conviction. "It could just be a precaution. The weather has been so harsh. Perhaps he simply wants the boys safe at home." But over the next few days, the truth became impossible to deny. The sickness had come to their region, carried along the roads by merchants and travelers, spread from village to village like fire through dry kindling. It started with the Tanner family in Barton, the same family whose son had been absent from school. Within 3 days, the father, mother, and 2 children were dead. Then it appeared in Thomas's own village. Old Martin the shepherd was the first, the same Martin who had lost his toes to frostbite years before. He died within a day of falling ill, his body covered in dark swellings that gave the disease its name, the Black Death, though at the time they simply called it the pestilence or the Great Mortality. The village priest, Father Hugh, called the villagers to the church for a special mass. Thomas attended with his family, cramming into the small stone building with perhaps 50 other people. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and the incense that Father Hugh burned in great quantities, as if the sweet smoke might drive away the invisible evil that stalked them. "God is testing us," Father Hugh proclaimed from his pulpit, his voice echoing in the cold space. "This pestilence is a punishment for our sins, a call to repentance. We must pray more fervently, confess our sins, and do penance. We must examine our hearts and root out the wickedness that has brought this plague upon us." Thomas, standing between his parents with Agnes and Margaret pressed close, felt the words like physical blows. What sins had he committed that deserved such punishment? He had sometimes been envious of boys with better food or warmer clothes. He had sometimes complained, if only in his heart, about the cold and the hardship of his life. He had sometimes fallen asleep during prayers when he was very tired. Were these sins great enough to bring down such terrible judgment? After the Mass, his father stopped to speak with some of the other men, and Thomas overheard fragments of their conversation. 3 more in the next village. The manor steward's family. No one to bring in the harvest if this continues. God have mercy on us all. That night at home, Thomas's father made a decision. "We're going to keep to ourselves," he announced. "No more unnecessary trips to the market, no more visits to neighbors. We have enough food stored to last us through the winter if we're careful. Thomas, you and I will see the animals and the necessary outdoor work, but your mother and sisters will stay inside as much as possible. We'll not go to church unless Father Hugh demands it. God will understand that we're trying to protect our family." "But William," Alina protested, "if we don't go to church, what will people think? They'll say we're impious, that we've lost faith." "Let them think what they want," William said grimly. "I'd rather have people think poorly of me than have my family dead. We've all heard what happens when this sickness takes hold. Whole families wiped out in days. I'll not risk you or the children if I can help it." So they withdrew into themselves, into their small house with its smoking hearth and its smell of sheep and cooking food and humanity. The days took on a strange, suspended quality. Thomas helped his father with the animals, hauling water from the well. They were fortunate to have a well on their land rather than having to use the village's common well, and spreading the meager store of hay they had saved for winter fodder. The cold was still brutal, and Thomas's feet still ached when he was out in it too long. But somehow the fear of the pestilence made the cold seem less important. Inside, his mother taught Agnes and Margaret to spin wool, their small fingers learning to work the drop spindle, creating uneven yarn that would eventually be knitted or woven into clothing. She taught them prayers and songs, stories about saints and angels. And in the evenings, by the firelight, she taught them letters, not from books, for they had none, but by scratching in the ashes with a stick. Thomas watched his sisters learning their letters with a mixture of pride and melancholy. Agnes was quick as he had been, forming her A's and B's with careful concentration. Margaret was too young to really understand, but she tried to copy what her sister did, her face screwed up with effort. Would they ever have the chance to attend school as he had? Would there even be a school left when the pestilence had passed? Would Father Edmund survive to teach another generation of students? On Christmas Eve, against his better judgment but unable to refuse his wife's pleading, William took the family to the church for midnight mass. The building was less than half full. Many families were staying away, whether from fear or because they were already sick. Thomas couldn't say. Father Hugh looked haggard, his face gaunt and his eyes haunted. He led them through the familiar rituals, the Latin words echoing in the cold stone space, and for a moment, Thomas felt a sense of normalcy, of connection to something larger and more enduring than the immediate terror of the pestilence. But when they left the church and walked home through the frozen darkness, they could see lights burning in the house of the village reeve, too many lights for that hour of the night. And the next morning, they learned that the reeve's wife had died during the night, her body covered with the telltale black swellings. The reeve himself was showing signs of illness. The rest of the winter passed in a blur of fear and isolation. More people in the village fell ill. Some recovered. This was the most hopeful thing, that recovery was possible, but most died. The carpenter died, leaving John's mother a widow with 4 children to feed. The baker died, and Stephen's family threw themselves on the mercy of the lord of the manor. The village priest, Father Hugh, who had tended to the sick despite the danger, fell ill in late January and was dead within 2 days. Thomas's family remained healthy, isolated in their small house, barely daring to hope that they might be spared. William made only the most necessary trips into the village, covering his face with a cloth soaked in vinegar. Someone had said that vinegar might protect against the miasmas that carried the disease. Each time he returned, Alina would make him strip off his outer clothes and leave them outside for a day before bringing them in, and she would wash his face and hands with strong lye soap that left his skin red and raw. They were hungry much of the time. Their food stores were running low, and there was no way to replenish them without going to the market, which William refused to allow. They ate thin pottage flavored with the last of their stored turnips and onions. They ate the dark rye bread that Alina baked, tough and hard to chew but filling. They killed one of their 3 sheep, a painful decision, as that sheep represented wealth and security, and the meat sustained them for 2 weeks. Thomas found himself thinking often about school, about Father Edmund and his fellow students. Were they alive? When would school resume? Would it resume? His wax tablet sat unused in a corner of the house, and sometimes he would take it out and practice his letters, trying to remember everything he had learned, trying not to let it slip away. His father watched him do this and said nothing, but Thomas saw the sadness in his eyes. In late February, as the worst of the winter began to break and the days grew incrementally longer, William made a trip into the village and returned with news. "The pestilence is passing," he said, though his voice held more relief than triumph. "There have been no new cases in over a week. Father Edmund has sent word that school will resume next Monday." Thomas felt a complicated mixture of emotions: relief that they had survived, grief for those who hadn't, and apprehension about returning to school, to a world that had been fundamentally changed by the pestilence. That Monday morning, as Thomas prepared to walk to school for the first time in nearly 3 months, His mother held him tightly for a long moment. "Be safe," she whispered against his hair. "And remember that you are alive, that you have been spared for a reason. Make it mean something." The walk to Barton was strange and eerie. The snow was melting, leaving patches of muddy earth and standing water. The world smelled of thaw and rot. As he passed through the village, he saw houses with their doors standing open, abandoned. He saw fresh graves in the churchyard, so many fresh graves, the earth still bare and dark above them. The schoolroom, when he reached it, was nearly empty. Of the 20 boys who had attended in December, only 8 returned. Thomas looked around at the faces he knew. John was there, looking thinner and more tired than before, but alive. Stephen was there, and 2 of the younger boys whose names Thomas barely knew. But so many were missing. Robert, who had sat near the brazier and shot Thomas hateful looks. Edward, the Reeves' grandson. Peter, the blacksmith's son. And others, boys whose names Thomas had known, but whose faces were already becoming hazy in his memory. Father Edmund looked like he had aged 10 years. His face was deeply lined. His hands shook slightly as he held his prayer book, and there was a haunted quality to his eyes. But his voice, when he spoke, was steady. "We will begin," he said, "by giving thanks to God for his mercy in sparing us, and by praying for the souls of our brethren who have been taken from us. Let us remember them not with despair, but with gratitude for the time we had with them, and with determination to honor their memory by continuing the work of learning they began." He led them in prayer, and Thomas found tears streaming down his face, for his lost classmates, for the village priest who had died tending the sick, for all the people who had vanished from the world in just a few short months. Around him, other boys were crying too, and Father Edmund made no move to stop them or chastise them. He simply waited until the tears had run their course, and then he said, "Now let us begin our lessons. We have much work to do." The schoolroom felt vast with so few students. Father Edmund moved the benches closer together, arranging them in a half circle near the brazier so that all the boys could be warm. There was more charcoal now, a dark irony that with so many dead, resources were more plentiful for those who remained. The boys could all sit close to the heat, and Thomas's fingers, for the first time in his memory, were warm enough to hold the stylus without pain. They began with Latin grammar, reviewing the declensions and conjugations that Thomas had struggled with before the pestilence. But there was a new intensity to the learning now, a sense that it mattered in a way it hadn't quite mattered before. They were the survivors. They had been spared, and somehow that meant they had a responsibility to make something of their lives to justify their survival. During the meal break, Thomas sat with John and Stephen. John had brought only a small piece of bread, even less than before, and his face was thin and pinched. Thomas shared his own meal without comment, and Stephen did the same. They ate in near silence, and then John spoke quietly. "My mother died," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. 2 weeks ago. The pestilence took her, even though we thought we were safe. My sisters and I are living with my uncle now. Not kind. He says I'm eating food that should go to his own children. He says I can't continue at school. Thomas felt his heart sink. John, no. You can't stop now. You're so close to being able to read properly, to write. What good is reading when you're starving? John asked, and there was such bitterness in his voice that Thomas had no answer. Stephen spoke up. My father has worked sometimes. He needs help in the bakery. I could ask him. Charity, John said. I don't want charity. I want my mother back. I want my father back. I want things to be the way they were. His voice cracked and he turned away, his thin shoulders shaking. Thomas reached out and gripped his friend's shoulder, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. What comfort could words provide against such loss? That night, Thomas told his parents about John's situation. His father listened gravely, then said, "The world has changed, Thomas. There are many orphans now, many children without parents or protection. The old social order is being disrupted. We must each decide what kind of people we want to be in this new world." What do you mean, Father? William looked at his son thoughtfully. I mean that we have choices. We can look only to our own survival, hoarding what we have and helping no one. Or we can remember our obligations to our neighbors, our Christian duty to help those in need. Neither choice is easy, and I won't judge a man for choosing to protect his own family first. But I would like to think that we can do something to help your friend. Over the next few days, Thomas's parents discussed the matter in low voices. Finally, his father announced a decision. John will come to eat with us 3 times a week. It's not much, but it's what we can spare. In exchange, he'll help with some work around the house and farm. Nothing too heavy, just tasks suitable for a boy. And he'll continue his schooling, as long as Father Edmund will teach him. Thomas felt a surge of gratitude and love for his parents so strong it left him breathless. He knew what this meant: less food for their own family, more strain on their already stretched resources. But they were doing it anyway. When Thomas told John of the arrangement, his friend's eyes filled with tears. I can't, it's too much. You can and you will, Thomas said firmly. And when you're a learned clerk or a priest with a good living, you'll remember this and help someone else in turn. That's how it works. So John joined their household 3 evenings a week, arriving in time for the evening meal and staying for a few hours afterward. He was painfully thin, and at first he ate with the desperate intensity of someone who didn't know when his next meal would come. But gradually, as he grew to trust that the food would continue, he relaxed somewhat. He helped Thomas's father with repairs around the house, and he played with Agnes and Margaret, telling them stories and making them laugh. He became, in a sense, part of their family. The winter gave way to early spring, and with the thaw came more grim discoveries, bodies that had lain frozen, undiscovered during the worst of the cold. The full extent of the pestilence's devastation became clear. Perhaps 1/3 of their village had died. In some places, the death toll was even higher. Whole families had been wiped out, leaving houses and lands with no clear heir. The social and economic structure that had governed their world for centuries was fracturing. At school, Father Edmund adapted to the new reality. With fewer students, he could give more individual attention to each boy. Thomas found his learning accelerating. He mastered the more complex Latin grammatical structures. He began to read not just the Psalter but other texts, saints' lives, portions of Scripture, even a fragment of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy that Father Edmund owned. The world of learning opened before him like a door swinging wide, and Thomas stepped through it eagerly. His hands still bore the scars of that brutal winter. His fingers had a tendency to ache in cold weather, and the tips of 2 toes on his right foot had blackened and eventually fallen off, leaving him with a slight limp. But these seemed like small prices to pay for survival. He had lived. He had continued learning. And somehow, in a world that had been turned upside down by death and loss, that felt like a kind of victory. In April, as the fields turned green and his father began spring plowing, Thomas sat in the schoolroom copying out a passage from the Gospel of John. In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The familiar Latin flowed from his stylus in letters that were now neat and confident, each stroke precise and sure. Father Edmund stopped beside him and looked down at his work. "Well done, Thomas," he said quietly. "Your hand has improved greatly. You write like a clerk now, not a child." Thomas looked up at his teacher, at this man who had survived the pestilence and the brutal winter, and continued to teach despite everything. "Thank you, Father. I want to learn everything I can. I want to be worthy of," he hesitated, not quite sure how to express what he felt. "Worthy of having survived." Father Edmund's expression softened. "You are worthy by virtue of being alive, Thomas. But I understand what you mean. We who remain have a duty to the dead, to learn, to remember, to build something from the ruins they left behind. You are doing that. Your friend John is doing that. All of you boys who come here day after day, despite the cold and the hardship and the loss, you are doing that." He paused, then added, "The world will need educated men more than ever now. There are so many positions empty, so many tasks left undone because those who knew how to do them have died. If you continue as you're going, Thomas, you could have a real future as a clerk or a scribe. Perhaps even more. I've been thinking of writing to the cathedral school in Lincoln, recommending you and John for further study. You're both bright enough, dedicated enough. You've proven you can endure hardship. That's worth something." Thomas felt his heart leap. The cathedral school, that was a level of education far beyond what he had dreamed possible. Far beyond what a Freeman farmer's son could normally aspire to. "Father, I don't. My parents couldn't afford." "Let me worry about that," Father Edmund said. "There are scholarships, benefices for promising students. And with so many clergy dead, the church is eager to train new priests and clerks. We'll see. Nothing is certain." but it's a possibility worth pursuing. That evening, Thomas told his parents what Father Edmund had said. His father's face showed a complex mixture of emotions: pride, hope, and something that might have been sadness. "You might leave us then," William said slowly. "Go away to Lincoln to study. We'd likely not see you for months, maybe years." "I wouldn't want to go if it would hurt you, Father," Thomas said quickly. William shook his head. "No, son. If this opportunity comes, you'll take it. Your mother and I didn't sacrifice for your education, so you could spend your life behind a plow. We did it so you could have a better life, more opportunities. If that means you leave us, well, that's the price of success, isn't it?" Elena reached over and took her husband's hand. "He'll always be our son," she said softly. "No matter where he goes or what he becomes. And if he does well, if he rises in the world, that will reflect well on all of us. Perhaps he can help his sisters, give them opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have." As the spring progressed and the days grew longer and warmer, Thomas threw himself into his studies with renewed intensity. He worked on his Latin until he could read fluently, until the words no longer required laborious translation but flowed naturally from the page to his mind. He practiced his writing until his hand was sure and steady, until Father Edmund had no more corrections to make. He studied arithmetic, learning to calculate and to understand the principles of geometry. He memorized prayers and psalms and could recite them flawlessly. John studied beside him, equally determined, equally intense. The two boys pushed each other, competed with each other in a friendly way, and celebrated each other's successes. They were bound together by shared hardship, shared loss, shared hope for the future. In late May, a letter arrived at the parish from the cathedral school in Lincoln. Father Edmund called Thomas and John to him after lessons one day and showed it to them. His hands trembled slightly as he held the parchment. "You have both been accepted," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "Scholarships have been granted based on my recommendation and on the need for educated young men to replace those lost to the pestilence. You will begin your studies in September. You will board at the school, living in the dormitory with the other students. Your instruction will include advanced Latin, logic, rhetoric, theology, and mathematics. This is a great opportunity, boys. A tremendous opportunity." Thomas felt dizzy, as if the world had tilted beneath him. It was one thing to dream of such an opportunity, another entirely to have it suddenly become real. He looked at John and saw the same shocked joy on his friend's face. "Thank you, Father," Thomas managed to say. "Thank you for believing in us, for teaching us, for giving us this chance." Father Edmund smiled, and for a moment he looked younger, less careworn. "Thank you for succeeding," he said. "By learning everything you can, by becoming men who will serve the church and society well. That will be thanks enough." That night, Thomas's family celebrated with a special meal. His mother had been saving a small piece of salt pork, and she used it to flavor a rich pottage. They ate until they were full, a rare luxury, and afterward Thomas's father brought out a small cup of ale that he had been saving for a special occasion. He poured a small amount for everyone, even the children, and raised his cup. "To my son Thomas," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "who survived frostbite and pestilence and hardship to achieve something I never dreamed possible, who will go to the cathedral school in Lincoln and make something of himself. May God grant him success and keep him safe." They drank, and Thomas tasted the ale on his tongue, bitter and sweet at the same time, like so much of life. He looked around at his family's faces, illuminated by the firelight, and tried to memorize this moment. His father with his weathered hands and his quiet pride, his mother with tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. Agnes looked at him with wide, admiring eyes. Little Margaret not quite understanding what was happening, but happy because everyone else was happy. "I won't forget you," Thomas said, and his voice cracked. "I won't forget where I came from or what you sacrificed for me. And someday, when I'm established, I'll help you. I'll make sure Agnes and Margaret have opportunities too. I'll make your sacrifices mean something." His father reached across the table and gripped Thomas's shoulder. "You already have, son. You've already made it mean something by surviving, by learning, by becoming the kind of young man who can receive such an opportunity. We're proud of you. So proud." The summer passed in a strange, bittersweet way. Thomas continued attending school, soaking up every last bit of knowledge Father Edmund could impart before he left for Lincoln. He helped his father in the fields, bringing in the hay and tending the animals, savoring these ordinary tasks that had once seemed tedious but now felt precious, because he knew he wouldn't be doing them much longer. He spent long hours with his sisters, teaching Agnes everything he knew about reading and writing, encouraging her natural quickness. "You're clever enough to be a scholar," he told her, though they both knew that opportunities for girls were limited. "But even if you can't go to school, knowing how to read and cipher will serve you well. It will give you options." Agnes listened seriously, practicing her letters with fierce concentration. "I want to be like you," she said one evening. "I want to learn everything." "Then learn," Thomas told her. "No one can stop you from learning if you're determined enough." In late August, Thomas and John made the journey to Lincoln in the company of Father Edmund, who had business at the cathedral. They walked for 2 days along roads that were still recovering from the devastation of the pestilence. They passed through villages that were half empty, saw fields that lay fallow for lack of workers to tend them. But they also saw signs of renewal, new families moving in to occupy empty houses, young people marrying and starting families, the slow, painful process of recovery and rebuilding. Lincoln was larger than any place Thomas had ever seen, with its great cathedral dominating the skyline, its narrow streets crowded with people and animals and carts, its smell of humanity and commerce and life. The cathedral school was housed in several buildings near the cathedral itself, and when they arrived, they were met by the master, a stern-faced priest named Roger who looked them over critically. "You come recommended by Father Edmund," he said, and his recommendation carries weight. But understand that the work here will be demanding. We are training you for service to the church and to learning itself. Many who come here do not complete their studies. They find the work too hard, the discipline too strict, the life too austere. Those who succeed are those who have the dedication and the strength to persevere. Thomas thought of the winter he had endured, of walking 2 miles through snow with frozen feet to sit in a cold schoolroom and try to form letters with numb fingers. He thought of the pestilence, of watching his world decimated by death. He thought of his family's sacrifices, of his mother knitting stockings by firelight, and his father going hungry so Thomas could have an extra portion of food. "I can persevere," he said quietly. "I know something about hardship. It won't stop me." Master Roger looked at him for a long moment, and something in his expression softened slightly. "Perhaps you do, boy. Perhaps you do. Well then, let us see what you're made of." That night, Thomas lay in his narrow bed in the dormitory, surrounded by the breathing of other boys, and thought about the journey that had brought him here. He thought about that brutal winter, about the cold that had nearly claimed his toes and his life, about the pestilence that had nearly claimed everything. He thought about Father Edmund teaching in that cold schoolroom day after day, about his parents sacrificing for his education, about John studying beside him despite loss and hunger. He was here because of all of them, because of their faith in him, their sacrifices, their determination that something good should come from all the suffering. He carried their hopes with him, along with the memory of those who hadn't survived, his classmates, the village priest, all the people who had died that terrible winter. He would not let them down. He would learn, he would grow. He would become someone who could make a difference in the world, who could honor the memory of those who had been lost. The winter had taught him that survival required more than just enduring. It required purpose, determination, and the refusal to let hardship break your spirit. And so, as he drifted off to sleep in this strange new place, Thomas of Barton, the freeman farmer's son who had learned his letters through frostbite and pestilence, made a silent promise to himself and to all those who had believed in him. He would succeed. He would learn. He would make his survival mean something. The story of that winter would stay with him always. The cold that had tested his body, the pestilence that had tested his courage, the sacrifices that had tested his worth. And he would carry forward the lessons it had taught him. That knowledge was worth suffering for, that human connection mattered more than comfort, that hope could survive even in the darkest times. Outside, the late summer wind whispered through the streets of Lincoln, carrying the promise of autumn and another winter to come. But Thomas was no longer afraid of the cold. He had already endured the worst winter of his life, and he had survived. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same determination that had carried him through frozen mornings and death-haunted days. He was a scholar now, a student at the cathedral school, a boy who had risen from the mud through learning and perseverance and the love of those who believed in him. And though the path ahead would surely hold more challenges, more hardships, more tests of his resolve, Thomas knew in his heart that he would continue forward, because that was what survivors did. They carried on, they learned, they grew. They honored the dead by living fully, by making the most of the opportunities that had been bought at such a terrible price. And so Thomas's journey continued, from that frost-bitten schoolroom to the halls of learning in Lincoln and beyond, carrying with him always the memory of that winter and the people who had shaped him during it. His story was their story too, a testament to human resilience, to the power of education, to the strength that could be found in the coldest, darkest times. The medieval winter had tried to break him, but instead, it had forged him into something stronger, something that could endure and grow and eventually flourish. And that perhaps was the greatest lesson of all. Thomas's story reaches a point of reflection and completion here, though his life would continue forward into new chapters of learning and growth. He had survived the twin trials of winter and pestilence, had held onto his dream of education despite tremendous hardship, and had finally reached the goal that had sustained him through so much suffering. His character had been tested and proven, his relationships had given him strength, and his determination had carried him through. This feels like a natural place to bring his immediate story to a close, though of course his life at the cathedral school would be another story entirely, one of intellectual growth, new challenges, and the fulfillment of the promise that winter had tested but not destroyed. Thomas's first weeks at the cathedral school in Lincoln were unlike anything he had experienced before. The dormitory where he slept held 30 boys, ranging in age from 10 to 17, and their snoring, coughing, and restless movements created a constant nighttime symphony that made sleep difficult. The room was long and narrow, with small windows set high in the stone walls and wooden beds arranged in 2 rows. Each boy had a thin straw mattress, a woolen blanket, and a small wooden chest for his possessions, though Thomas had almost nothing to put in his. He owned 2 tunics, an extra pair of stockings his mother had knitted, his wax tablet and stylus, and a small wooden cross his father had carved for him as a parting gift. The daily routine was rigid and unforgiving. The boys rose at dawn when the cathedral bells rang for lauds, the first prayer service of the day. They had a few minutes to dress and splash cold water on their faces from the communal basin, and then they were expected to file into the cathedral for the service. The cathedral was vast and cold, its stone columns soaring up into shadows, its floor worn smooth by centuries of feet. In the early morning darkness, lit only by candles, it felt like stepping into another world, ancient, holy, and utterly indifferent to the small human concerns of hungry, tired boys. After lauds came a simple breakfast in the refectory, a room almost as large as the dormitory, with long wooden tables and benches. Breakfast consisted of bread, better quality than the rye bread Thomas had grown up eating, made from wheat flour and small beer, watered wine, or sometimes warm milk. The boys ate in silence while one of the older students read aloud from scripture or the lives of saints. Master Roger, the head of the school, sat at a raised table at the front of the room, watching them with stern eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Then came lessons. The students were divided into groups based on their level of learning. Thomas and John, along with 6 other boys who had come from various parish schools, were placed in the intermediate group. Above them were the advanced students, who studied theology, philosophy, and canon law. Below them were the beginners, boys who were just learning their letters and basic Latin grammar. Their primary instructor was Brother William, a Benedictine monk in his 50s who had studied at Oxford in his youth and now devoted himself to teaching. He was a compact man with bright, intelligent eyes and hands that moved constantly as he spoke, sketching diagrams in the air or emphasizing points with precise gestures. He was exacting but not cruel, expecting much from his students but willing to help those who struggled if they showed genuine effort. The first day, Brother William assessed their knowledge by having each boy read aloud from a Latin text and then translate it. When Thomas's turn came, he stood and read from the Psalter, his voice steady despite his nervousness. He stumbled over a few of the more complex constructions, but overall, his reading was fluent and his translation accurate. Brother William nodded approvingly. "You have been well taught," he said. "Father Edmund's letter spoke highly of you, and I see it was not empty praise. But you have much yet to learn. Your pronunciation needs refinement. You carry the accent of your region in your Latin, which will need to be smoothed away. Your vocabulary is limited to religious texts, and you will need to expand it considerably. And your understanding of grammar, while functional, lacks the deeper comprehension necessary for truly elegant composition." Thomas nodded, absorbing the criticism without taking offense. He knew he had much to learn. That was why he was here. The lessons were intensive and demanding. They spent hours each day on Latin grammar, working through increasingly complex texts, learning not just to translate, but to analyze the structure and style of the writing. They studied rhetoric, learning the principles of persuasive speech and writing that had been passed down from ancient Rome. They studied logic, working through the intricacies of syllogisms and argumentation. And they studied scripture, memorizing passages, discussing interpretations, exploring the layers of meaning in the sacred text. In addition to formal lessons, the boys were expected to attend multiple prayer services throughout the day: lauds at dawn, prime in the early morning, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers in the evening, and compline before bed. Each service pulled them away from their studies for a period of worship in the cathedral, their voices joining with those of the cathedral clergy and the townspeople in prayers and psalms that had been chanted for centuries. Thomas found the routine exhausting, but also strangely comforting. There was a rhythm to it, a structure that left little room for worry or uncertainty. You knew what you would be doing at any given hour, knew what was expected of you. And the work itself, the intellectual work of wrestling with difficult texts and complex ideas, was deeply satisfying in a way that physical labor had never been. John adapted to the new life more slowly. He struggled with some of the more advanced Latin, and his thin frame and nervous disposition made him a target for the casual cruelty that boys sometimes showed to those they perceived as weak. There was one student in particular, a boy named Hugh from a wealthy merchant family in York, who seemed to take particular pleasure in mocking John's shabby clothes, his accent, his occasional grammatical errors. One evening in late September, Thomas found John sitting alone in the dormitory after supper, his face red and his eyes brimming with unshed tears. When Thomas asked what had happened, John shook his head at first, but Thomas pressed him, and finally the story came out. "Hugh said I don't belong here," John whispered. "He said I'm just a peasant playing at being a scholar, that I'll never be more than a village priest in some forgotten place. He said everyone can tell I'm not quality, that I smell like the farm, that my Latin sounds like a pig grunting." His voice broke. "And maybe he's right, Thomas. Maybe I don't belong here. Everyone else seems to understand things so much faster than I do. Maybe I should just go back." "No," Thomas said firmly. He sat down beside his friend and gripped his shoulder. "Hugh is a bully and a fool. You belong here as much as anyone. More than Hugh, in fact, because you actually want to learn, not just collect credentials to impress your future business partners. You're struggling because you've had fewer advantages than some of the others, not because you lack ability. I've seen how hard you work, how much you've improved already." "But what if it's not enough?" John asked. "What if I fail? My uncle will never take me back. I'll have nowhere to go." Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "Then we'll make sure you don't fail. From now on, we'll study together every evening after supper. I'll help you with the things you find difficult, and you can help me with the things I struggle with. Your memory for scripture passages is better than mine. We'll work together, like we did at Father Edmund's school. We survived winter and pestilence together, John. We can survive this." John looked at him, and slowly the despair in his eyes gave way to something like hope. "You do that. Spend your free time helping me." "You're my friend," Thomas said simply. "That's what friends do." So they established a new routine. After supper, while the other boys spent their brief free time playing dice games or talking or simply resting, Thomas and John would find a quiet corner and work through the day's lessons together. Thomas would quiz John on vocabulary and grammar, would help him parse difficult Latin constructions, and would explain the logical principles that Brother William had covered in class. And John, in turn, would help Thomas memorize the long passages of Scripture they were required to know, would test him on the order of the canonical hours, and would share his insights into the spiritual meanings of the texts they studied. Gradually, steadily, John's performance improved. His translations became more accurate, his oral recitations more confident. And when Hugh made another mocking comment about John's abilities, Brother William happened to overhear. "Hugh of York," the monk said, his voice cutting through the classroom like a blade, "I would encourage you to focus on your own work rather than criticizing your fellows. John's most recent translation of Cicero was notably superior to your own, which suggests that your time might be better spent in study than in mockery. Unless, of course, you wish to explain to Master Roger why you believe yourself qualified to judge your classmates when your own performance is so often merely adequate." Hugh flushed red and said nothing more. After that, his bullying of John became more subtle, confined to sneers and whispered comments rather than open mockery. It wasn't ideal, but it was an improvement. As autumn deepened and the days grew shorter, Thomas found himself settling into the life of the school. He made other friends besides John. There was Peter, the son of a minor knight from Nottinghamshire, who was quick-witted and irreverent but fundamentally kind. There was Martin, a quiet boy from Norfolk whose father was a successful wool merchant and who had a gift for mathematics that Thomas envied. There was Geoffrey, who wanted to be a poet and was always composing verses in Latin that ranged from genuinely beautiful to hilariously awful. Together, they formed a small group that studied together, ate together, and shared the small rebellions that made the strict life of the school bearable. They would sometimes sneak extra food from the kitchen, not much, just an apple or a piece of cheese, to supplement their meals. They would occasionally skip Compline, the last prayer service of the day, claiming illness or urgent study needs, and spend the time talking quietly in the dormitory about their dreams and fears and hopes for the future. Thomas learned things from these boys that had nothing to do with Latin or logic. Peter taught him how to fence with wooden practice swords, a skill required of young men of noble birth. Martin taught him the principles of accounting and how merchants calculated profit and loss. Geoffrey introduced him to the works of the ancient poets, Virgil and Ovid and Horace, whose writings were more concerned with human passion and beauty than with religious devotion. But Thomas also kept apart from them in certain ways. He never forgot that he was there on scholarship, that his place at the school had been bought by his family's sacrifices and Father Edmund's faith in him. He couldn't afford to fail or to be expelled for misbehavior. So while he participated in small rebellions, he never did anything truly risky. He worked harder than most of the other boys, stayed up later studying by candlelight when he could afford the candles, pushed himself to master each lesson thoroughly before moving on to the next. Winter came early that year. By late October, frost was painting the windows of the dormitory in intricate patterns, and Thomas felt a familiar anxiety as the temperature dropped. His feet, scarred by the frostbite of the previous winter, ached in the cold. He began wearing both pairs of stockings all the time, and he wrapped his feet in rags for extra insulation at night. The cathedral school was warmer than Father Edmund's schoolroom had been. The stone buildings retained heat better than the timber-framed structure attached to the parish church, and there were larger braziers and more frequent fires. But it was still cold, particularly in the early mornings and late evenings. The dormitory was especially frigid at night, and Thomas would often wake to find his breath frosting in the air and ice forming in the water basin. But this winter, Thomas knew how to protect himself better. He knew to keep moving when he felt his extremities going numb, knew to rub snow on frost-bitten skin to restore circulation, knew the warning signs that meant he needed to find warmth immediately. And he had better food now than he'd had at home. The school's meals were simple but regular and substantial, ensuring that the boys had enough calories to maintain body heat through the cold months. In November, as Thomas walked to the cathedral for lauds one morning, snow crunching under his feet in the pre-dawn darkness, he encountered an old man sitting against the wall of a building, wrapped in rags, shivering violently. Thomas stopped, looking down at him. The man's face was blue with cold, his lips cracked and bleeding, his eyes barely focusing. Thomas knew he should keep walking. He would be late for lauds if he delayed, and tardiness was punished with a day of fasting. He had nothing to give the man, no food, no money, barely enough warm clothes for himself. And there were always beggars in the streets of Lincoln, far too many to help them all. But he thought of his own family, of the winter his father had taken John in and shared their meager food with him. He thought of the lessons in charity he had learned from Father Hugh in his village church. He thought of the passage from Matthew they had studied the previous week. "Whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers, that you do unto me." He unwrapped his cloak, the same thin woolen cloak he had worn the winter before, now patched in several places, and draped it around the old man's shoulders. "Go to St. Mary's Church," he said, pointing down the street. "Tell the priest that you need shelter. They have a warming room for the poor." The old man looked up at him with rheumy eyes and mumbled something Thomas couldn't understand. Thomas helped him to his feet and pointed him in the right direction, then hurried on to the cathedral, shivering in just his tunic but feeling strangely warm inside. He was late for lauds, and Master Roger noted it with a stern look. That afternoon, Thomas was called to the master's office, a small room lined with books and smelling of ink and parchment and cold stone. "You were late for lauds this morning," Master Roger said without preamble. "The punishment is a day of fasting. However, I understand from Father Benedict at St. Mary's that you gave your cloak to a beggar and helped him to the church. Is this true?" Thomas nodded, unsure whether this made things better or worse. Master Roger studied him for a long moment. "The rule exists for a reason. Discipline is necessary for learning, and exceptions cannot be made without undermining the entire structure. You will fast today as punishment for your tardiness." He paused, and something that might have been approval flickered across his severe face. "However, Father Benedict was impressed by your charity, and he has sent a donation to the school in your name, enough to cover a new cloak for you, which will be provided. In the future, try to balance your charitable impulses with your obligations to the school." Dismissed. Thomas left the office feeling confused but oddly pleased. He would be hungry today, but he would have a new cloak, probably warmer than his old one, and somehow the approval of Master Roger, grudging though it was, meant more to him than he would have expected. The fasting day was difficult. By evening, his stomach was cramping with hunger, and he felt lightheaded and weak. But he had been hungry before, many times, and he knew he could endure it. And when he finally broke his fast the next morning with breakfast, the simple bread and milk tasted better than any feast. True to Master Roger's word, a new cloak was delivered to him that afternoon. Thick wool dyed a dark blue, lined with a softer fabric. It was finer than anything Thomas had ever owned, and he felt almost guilty wearing it. But it was also wonderfully warm, and as winter deepened, He was grateful for it. December brought heavy snows that transformed Lincoln into a white landscape of muffled sound and ethereal beauty. The cathedral, already imposing, became even more majestic with snow on its roof and ice crystals hanging from its gargoyles. The streets were treacherous, and the boys were warned to be careful when walking between the school buildings and the cathedral. One afternoon, as Thomas and his friends were making their way back from Vespers, they heard shouting from a nearby alley. They looked at each other uncertainly. They were supposed to go directly back to the school, but the shouting sounded urgent, frightened. Thomas made a decision and turned toward the alley, the others following. They found a group of 3 older boys, not students, but apprentices or servants by their dress, surrounding a smaller boy who was backed against a wall. The smaller boy was perhaps 8 or 9, thin and ragged, clutching a small loaf of bread to his chest. One of the older boys was demanding he hand it over, and the others were laughing at his frightened protests. "Leave him alone," Thomas said, his voice sounding braver than he felt. The older boys were bigger than him and his friends, and they outnumbered them. The largest of the bullies turned to face them, a sneer on his face. "This doesn't concern you, little scholars. Go pray your prayers and leave us be." "He's just a child," Peter said, moving up to stand beside Thomas. "Let him keep his bread." "Make me," the bully said, and shoved Thomas hard in the chest. Thomas stumbled back but didn't fall. For a moment, everything hung in balance. A fight seemed inevitable, and Thomas had no idea how it would turn out. But then Jeffrey stepped forward, and there was something in his bearing, in the way he carried himself, that made the bullies hesitate. "My father is the Earl of Derby's Chancellor," Jeffrey said, his voice cold and aristocratic in a way Thomas had never heard before. "My uncle is a justice in the King's Court. And these are my friends, students at the cathedral school under the protection of the Bishop of Lincoln himself. If you harm any of us, or if you harm this child, I will ensure that you are hunted down and punished to the fullest extent of the law. Do you understand me?" It was probably a bluff. Jeffrey had never mentioned such illustrious connections before, but it was delivered with such utter conviction that the bullies believed it. They looked at each other uncertainly, and then the leader spat on the ground and said, "Keep your precious child then. He's not worth the trouble." They slunk away into the gathering dusk, and the small boy looked up at his rescuers with wide, terrified eyes. Thomas knelt down to be at his level. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. "Did they hurt you?" The boy shook his head mutely. "Where do you live? Can you get home safely?" The boy pointed vaguely toward the lower part of the city, then turned and ran, still clutching his bread, disappearing into the maze of alleys before Thomas could say anything else. As they walked back to the school, Peter clapped Jeffrey on the shoulder. "That was well done. I had no idea your father worked for an earl." Jeffrey grinned sheepishly. "He doesn't. My father is a wool merchant in London." "But they didn't know that, did they?" "I figured if I sounded confident enough, they'd believe me." They all laughed, giddy with relief and the excitement of having stood up to the bullies. But Thomas felt something else too, a sense that this was what education was for, not just learning Latin and logic, but having the confidence and the authority to stand up for those weaker than yourself, to use words and bearing as weapons when physical strength wasn't enough. That night, lying in his bed in the dormitory, Thomas thought about how much had changed since the previous winter. A year ago, he had been struggling to form letters in Father Edmund's freezing schoolroom, his fingers so cold he could barely grip his stylus, his family barely surviving, the pestilence looming over everything like a shadow. Now he was at the cathedral school in Lincoln, learning from some of the finest teachers in England, wearing a warm cloak, eating regular meals, and intervening to protect children from bullies in the street. It felt unreal, like he was living someone else's life. But the ache in his scarred feet reminded him that it was real, that he had earned this through endurance and determination and the sacrifices of people who loved him, and he was determined not to waste it. Christmas came, and with it a brief respite from lessons. Most of the wealthier students went home to their families for the holiday, but Thomas and John and several others whose homes were too far away or whose families couldn't afford the journey remained at the school. Master Roger arranged for a special Christmas feast in the refectory: roasted goose and pork, fresh bread, apples preserved in honey, even a small portion of spiced wine for each student. It was the finest meal Thomas had ever eaten, and yet as he ate, he thought of his family at home. Were they having a good Christmas? Had his father been able to afford a goose, or were they eating their usual pottage? Were Agnes and Margaret warm enough? Did they miss him as much as he missed them? After the meal, Master Roger stood and addressed the students who remained. "You are far from your homes and families this Christmas," he said, his stern voice softening slightly. "But you are not alone. You are part of a community here, bound together by your pursuit of learning and your service to God. Remember that education is itself a gift that many in this world will never receive. Use it well. Use it to serve others, to spread light in dark places, to make the world better than you found it." Later that night, Thomas and John and a few other boys gathered in the dormitory and sang carols, the same carols Thomas had sung in his village church, the same ones he had sung with his family. The words echoed in the cold stone room, carrying memories of home and family and all the winters that had come before. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel." Their young voices rose in harmony, rough but sincere, and for a moment Thomas felt connected across the miles to his family, to his village, to all the people he had left behind. Winter deepened, and the lessons continued. Thomas worked through increasingly complex Latin texts. He read Cicero's speeches and letters, studied Virgil's Aeneid, analyzed the elegant prose of Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars. He learned the principles of formal logic, working through syllogisms and proofs until he could construct and deconstruct arguments with ease. He studied theology, grappling with questions about the nature of God, the problem of evil, the meaning of grace and salvation. Some days the learning came easily, flowing into his mind like water into a vessel. Other days it was hard, frustrating, and he would sit with his head in his hands, staring at a page of Latin that seemed incomprehensible, wondering if he had reached the limit of his abilities. But on those days he would think of his father's words, "The boy is quick. He has a mind for learning." He would think of Father Edmund's faith in him. He would think of his family's sacrifices. And he would bend over the text again and keep trying until understanding came. John struggled more than Thomas did, but he never gave up. There were nights when Thomas would find him in tears over a particularly difficult passage, convinced he was too stupid to understand it. But Thomas would sit with him, patient and encouraging, breaking the problem down into smaller pieces until John could see the pattern and could grasp the meaning. And gradually, slowly, John improved until he was holding his own in the intermediate class, no longer the weakest student, no longer a target for mockery. In late January, Brother William assigned them a major project. Each student was to compose an original letter in Latin on a topic of their choosing, demonstrating proper grammar, rhetoric, and style. The letters would be copied onto good parchment and evaluated by Master Roger himself, and the best ones would be kept in the school's archives as examples for future students. Thomas spent days thinking about what to write. He considered writing about theological questions, or about the importance of education, or about current events. There were rumors of war with France, rumors of new outbreaks of pestilence in other parts of England. But finally, he decided to write about what he knew best, his own experience. He composed a letter addressed to future students of this school, telling them about his journey from a freeman farmer's son to a cathedral school scholar. He wrote about the winter he had learned through frostbite, about the pestilence that had decimated his village, about the sacrifices his family had made for his education. He wrote about the importance of perseverance, of never giving up even when the cold seemed unbearable or the task impossible. He wrote about the responsibility that came with privilege, the duty to use one's education to serve others and to honor those who had made it possible. The Latin flowed from his pen with surprising ease, each sentence carefully constructed, each word chosen for maximum effect. He worked on it for 2 weeks, writing and revising, polishing each phrase until it gleamed. When he finally presented it to Brother William, he was as proud of it as he had ever been of anything in his life. Brother William read it slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at Thomas, and there was something like wonder in his eyes. "This is exceptional work, Thomas," he said quietly. "The Latin is fluent and elegant. The rhetoric is persuasive, but more than that, it's genuine. You write from the heart, and that gives your words power that technique alone could never achieve. Master Roger will be impressed." A week later, Master Roger called Thomas to his office. The master sat behind his desk, Thomas's letter spread out before him, and when Thomas entered, he gestured for him to sit. "I have read your letter," Master Roger said, "and I am forced to revise my initial assessment of you. When you arrived here, I saw a promising student, certainly, but I wondered if you had the depth of character necessary for true scholarship. Scholarship is not merely about memorizing texts or constructing grammatically correct sentences. It is about understanding the human condition, about seeing connections between learning and life, about having something meaningful to say. He tapped the letter with one finger. This demonstrates that you have those qualities. You write with wisdom beyond your years, born of genuine hardship and reflection. Your Latin is not yet perfect. There are still small errors of style and idiom, but that will come with time and practice. What matters is that you have found your voice as a writer. He paused, looking at Thomas with an expression that might have been respectful. I am recommending you for advanced placement. Starting next month, you will join the senior class, studying with students several years older than you. The work will be significantly more difficult, but I believe you are ready for it. Do you accept this opportunity? Thomas felt his heart hammering in his chest. Advanced placement meant he would complete his studies faster, would be able to move on to university studies, or take a position as a clerk sooner. It meant he was succeeding beyond even his own expectations. Yes, Master Roger, he said, his voice steady despite his excitement. I accept, and I thank you for the opportunity. I will not disappoint you. See that you don't, Master Roger said, but there was the slightest hint of a smile at the corners of his mouth. You have been given much, Thomas of Barton. Much is therefore expected of you. Now go and tell your friend John that his letter was also quite good, and that he should continue working with the same diligence he has shown these past months. Thomas left the office walking on air. He found John in the dormitory and shared the news, both his own advancement and Master Roger's praise for John's work. John's face lit up with genuine happiness for Thomas's success, and Thomas felt a surge of affection for this friend who had been through so much with him. You'll be studying with the older boys now, John said, and there was only the slightest note of wistfulness in his voice. You'll be too advanced for me. We'll still study together in the evenings, Thomas said firmly. And I'll help you prepare for your own advancement. This doesn't change anything between us, John. We're still friends, still in this together. And they were. As February gave way to March and Thomas began his studies with the advanced class, he continued to meet with John each evening, helping his friend work through the intermediate lessons, while Thomas himself grappled with the more complex material he was now learning: philosophy, advanced rhetoric, canon law, theological disputes. The advanced class was taught by Father Hugh, the school's most senior instructor, a man in his 60s who had studied at Paris in his youth and who had a mind like a razor. He pushed his students mercilessly, demanding not just that they understand the material, but that they engage with it critically, that they form their own arguments and defend them against objections. Thomas found the work exhilarating and exhausting in equal measure. For the first time in his life, he was struggling academically, having to work harder than ever before just to keep up. There were days when he felt completely out of his depth, surrounded by older students who had been studying longer, and who seemed to grasp concepts that eluded him. But he didn't give up. He stayed up late into the night, reading by the light of precious candles, working through difficult texts until his eyes burned and his head ached. He asked questions when he didn't understand, even when he feared looking foolish. He wrote and rewrote his essays until they met Father Hugh's exacting standards. And slowly, gradually, he improved. The concepts that had seemed impossibly abstract began to make sense. The arguments that had seemed impenetrable revealed their structure. He found himself able to engage in the sophisticated philosophical debates that Father Hugh encouraged, holding his own against students years older than himself. One afternoon in late March, as the winter finally began to break and the first hints of spring appeared, snowdrops pushing through the melting snow, longer days, a warmth in the air that promised renewal, Father Hugh asked Thomas to remain after class. "I have been observing your progress," the old priest said, settling into his chair with a slight groan. "And I am curious about something. You are younger than any other student in the advanced class. You come from a background that provided you with far less preparation than your peers, and yet you are performing at or above their level. How do you account for this?" Thomas thought carefully before answering. "I think, Father, that hardship can be a teacher as valuable as any book. The winter I learned through frostbite taught me that I could endure more than I thought possible, that suffering could be borne if there was purpose behind it. The pestilence taught me that life is brief and uncertain, that opportunities must be seized because they may not come again. And my family's sacrifices taught me that my education is not just about me. It's about honoring their faith in me, about making their hardships mean something." Father Hugh nodded slowly. "Yes, I see. There is a quality in you that I recognize, Thomas, a quality I have seen in only a handful of students over my many years of teaching. You have been forged by adversity, and it has made you stronger rather than breaking you. This is rare and valuable." He leaned forward, his old eyes bright with intensity. "I am writing to my former colleagues at Oxford. I believe you should continue your studies there at the university. You have the mind for it, and more importantly, you have the character. It would be a waste for you to stop your education at the level of this school. With proper university training, you could become a significant scholar, perhaps even a teacher yourself someday. Would this interest you?" Oxford. Thomas had heard of it, of course. One of the great universities of Europe, where the finest minds gathered to study and debate. But it had seemed as far beyond his reach as the moon, and now Father Hugh was suggesting it as a real possibility. "I would have to ask my family," Thomas said slowly. "My father has already sacrificed so much for my education. I don't know if he could afford it." "There are scholarships," Father Hugh interrupted. "Benefices for promising students. I have some influence in these matters, and I believe I could secure funding for you. But you would need to continue working as hard as you have been, proving that you are worthy of such investment. Think about it. Pray about it. And let me know your decision within the month." That night, Thomas wrote a long letter to his father, telling him about everything that had happened. His advancement to the senior class. Father Hughes offered to recommend him for Oxford. His own uncertainty about whether he should reach for something so far beyond what his family had originally envisioned for him. He poured his heart into the letter, asking for his father's guidance and blessing. It took 3 weeks for his father's reply to arrive, and during that time, Thomas alternated between hope and anxiety, excitement and guilt. When the letter finally came, delivered by a traveling merchant who knew his village, Thomas's hands shook as he broke the seal. His father's letter was brief. William of Barton was not a man comfortable with writing, though he had learned enough to scratch out a few lines. But it was everything Thomas needed to hear. "My dear son, your mother and I are prouder than words can say. You have already exceeded our dreams. If this Father Hugh believes you should go to Oxford, then you should go. Do not worry about us or about the cost. The Lord has provided for us so far, and He will continue to provide. Your success is our success. Your learning honors our family and our village. Go to Oxford with our blessing and our love, and know that we will pray for you every day. Your loving father, William of Barton." Thomas read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face, and then he went to find Father Hugh to tell him his decision.